Good morning, class, and as always, I am your professor, Mary Ainsworth. For your homework, I assigned everyone to listen to a podcast that I was featured in which I spoke to you about how the recent COVID situation relates to my research about attachment theory. To summarize quickly, we went over the three different types of attachment styles: secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment, and how people with each attachment style might be reacting to the current COVID situation. At the end, I gave tips for caregivers on how they can help their child form healthy attachments. If you have not yet heard the podcast, I strongly suggest you to listen to it after class as it is testable material. So, I've been keeping my eye out to see if other psychologists are also giving their thoughts about the current COVID situation, and I came across an article by Ivan Pavlov. In today's class, I wanted to share with you my thoughts on his article. Before we begin, I hope that the name Ivan Pavlov rings a bell, pun intended. But since he will appear on your midterm, I don't think that there's any harm in reviewing. Ivan Pavlov is a Russian psychologist known very well for his work with classical conditioning. Recall the terminology we learned in Lecture 3: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. We learned how in his experiment with the dogs, when the bell, or the neutral stimulus, was continually paired with the food, the unconditioned stimulus, the bell itself was able to elicit the salivation response, which was the unconditioned response. The bell then became the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation the conditioned response. So, in his article, Ivan Pavlov spoke about how recently COVID-19 has been referred to, and please pardon my language, the China virus and the Kung flu. Pavlov suggests that constantly pairing the previously mentioned terms with COVID-19 will then cause the fear elicited by COVID-19 to be paired with China or the Chinese population. I think that this is a very practical example of classical conditioning, and I do agree that this is very probable to happen with repeated pairing. As a developmental psychologist, I think that children will be most susceptible to such prejudice as they are still learning concepts and how different concepts associate or relate to one another. I think that it is especially important to not only stop the use of such terms, but also educate young children so they will not mistakenly associate a race with COVID. But there is an important piece of text that I wanted to flag from the article that I disagree with. Pavlov states that because of the pairing of China with COVID, he's afraid that people will continue to socially distance from Southeast Asians even when COVID is over. Can anyone see what I think the problem is? Exactly. As we learned early on, and hint, this is likely to appear on an exam, if a conditioned stimulus is presented alone without an unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response will likely cease. So, in other words, if a conditioned stimulus, in this case China, is presented alone without an unconditioned stimulus, in this case COVID, the fear or the conditioned response will likely cease. So this is why I disagree with Pavlov's suggestion. That's all for today's class. Please do take a look at Pavlov's article before our next class. Feel free to add any comments or thoughts that I may have missed to our discussion board, and have a good one, guys.